Okay, so the last video we talked about just the basic idea of how you use factoring to solve a quadratic equation. In this video, we're just going to look at a few examples. So with that said, just a quick reminder of our learning objectives for this particular topic. The main one and the one that we're going to focus on in this video is just simply be able to find the solutions using factoring. We did talk in the last solution about knowing whether or not there would be one or two solutions. And we said, if you're going to use factoring, there'll never be zero solutions using factoring. And in the last video, we outlined these steps for solving quadratic equations by factoring. First, get it in standard form and equal to 0. That's hugely important and a step that students often forget. Then factor it. Once you get it factored, set each equation equal to 0. Okay, so in the last video, we did a couple of examples using this process. All we're going to do in this video is a few more examples. We're going to try and make them a little bit different than what we saw last time. So here is our first example for this particular video. Let us solve the equation 10x squared equals x plus 3. Okay. So we've got the procedure right here. In all of these examples, I'm going to encourage you, if you feel like you're comfortable with this, try pausing the video and doing it on your own first, and then resume the video to see if your work matches mine. Okay, but let's get started. Whether you've done this already or not, let's talk about how we do this. The first thing we want to do is have it equal to 0 and in standard form. Okay, that's usually important. Some students try to take a square root right away. But we talked about in the last video that doesn't work because these things are not squared. And so therefore the square roots won't cancel out and you're just going to be stuck. So instead, we're going to put it in standard form. And so when we put it in standard form, here's a little hint that I'm going to tell you. When I do this, a little hint, I have found that it's always easier. It's always easier if you keep the squared term positive. Keep the squared term positive. It's always easier to factor when the squared term is positive. So in this particular case, I could subtract 10x squared from both sides and move that over here. But then my 10 would be a negative number. And that's going to make it harder to factor. In fact, most people just simply get it wrong if their leading term is negative. So instead, I'm going to subtract x from both sides. And remember, these are not like terms, so they don't combine, right? Because the exponents are different. And I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. And again, none of these are like terms, so they don't combine. I'm going to end up with that. Okay, so that's going to be my first step. Get it equal to 0. And I'm going to get equal to 0, keeping the first term positive. It's always easier if the first term is positive. All right, so there's the first thing. Now I'm going to factor that. And so for this, I'm going to use grouping. So I'm going to do 10 times 3 over here on some scratch paper. That gives me 30. My factors of 30 are these. And 5 and 6. There we go. There's my factors of 30. And I want to find the factors that will subtract to equal 1. And right now, I don't care that it's a negative 1, right? I just want subtract to equal 1. So 6 minus 5, right? That subtracts to equal 1. But now I want to arrange them to make sure that I get a negative 1 when I combine them back together. So I can't do 6 minus 5. That would give me a positive 1. I'm going to do 5 minus 6. So again, remember, I start picking my pair of numbers here, ignoring the sign. But then once I pick the pair that I'm going to use, I choose to make them positive or negative based on making it match the sign that I have here. So since I need it to be a negative, I'm going to arrange this like that. And now I can do grouping. So in my first group, I can factor out a 5x. That's going to leave behind a 2x plus 1, which means my second group here also has to have a 2x plus 1. So a negative 3 divided by 1 is negative 3. So I must have factored out negative 3. If I distribute that, Negative 3 times 2 gives me negative 6. That seems like it works. Okay, so that means one of my factors is a 2x plus 1, and the other factor is a 5x minus 3. So now I'm done with my second step. I've factored my polynomial. So the way that I finish is I'm going to take each one of those factors, set them equal to 0, and solve those little equations. So a 2x plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides. That gives me a 2x equals negative 1. And then divide both sides by 2. And that gives me an x equals negative 1/2. So there's my first answer. My other answer is going to be when I set 5x minus 3 equal to 0, add 3 to both sides. That gives me a 5x equals 3. And now divide both sides by 5. And I get x equals 3/5. And so those are my two answers to this particular problem. I knew I was going to get two answers because when I factored it, I ended up with two different factors. Okay, so there we go. There's our process. So step one was right here, get it equal to 0. There was step one. Step two was right here, get it factored. And then step 3 was down here, set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Okay, so there's our first example for this video. Here's example number 2. We are going to solve the equation 4x squared plus 10x equals 0. Okay, so again, I'm going to encourage you, pause the video and try to use these 3 methods to solve this on your own, and then resume the video to check. Okay, so hopefully you've done this, and hopefully you recognize that this is a different sort of expression. I don't have 3 terms, so grouping is going to be difficult for me to use. I don't have perfect squares everywhere, so shortcuts are not going to really work for me. So this goes back to the only other method we've learned, which is the greatest common factor. And technically, when we learned factoring, we said you should start by checking greatest common factor first. And indeed, in this case, I look to see both of my numbers are even. That means I can divide them both by 2. And both terms have an x, so I can factor out a 2x from this. So if I factor out a 2x, then 2x times what equals 4x squared? Well, that would be 2x times 2x. And 2x times what equals 10x? Well, that would be 2x times 5. And so there's my factorization. Now remember, this means I have a 2x times a 2x plus 5. So both of these are factors. So I have just finished step 2 and I'm ready for step 3. And for step 3, I set both of these equal to 0. And then I solve those little equations. So for this one, I'm dividing by 2. And 0 divided by 2 equals 0. So one of my answers is going to just simply be 0. And for this one, I'll subtract 5 from both sides and then divide by 2. And that's going to give me x equals negative 5/2. And again, you can write that as a decimal if you want to, and that's fine. Okay, so the main idea from this particular example is remember that there's other kinds of factoring besides just grouping, and don't fall into the trap of always trying to do grouping. Okay, so that brings us to our third and our final example for this particular video. For this example, what I'm going to ask you to do, please, is to factor the equation, or I'm sorry, to solve the equation x squared minus 16 equals 0. X squared minus 16 equals 0. So solve that equation. All right, hopefully you did solve that equation. Hopefully you've got that done. If not, pause the video and go back and do that. But the thing with this is that we really can do this 2 different ways. We can do this by factoring, because we recognize that both of these are squares. So I can take the square root of x squared and I'll get x. I can take the square root of 16 and I'll get 4. So that means I can use one of my shortcuts. And this is the shortcut difference of squares, where one of these gets a plus sign and one gets a minus sign. And so my answer becomes x plus 4 equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. So when I solve these 2 equations for x, I'm going to get a 4 and a -4 for my answers. Okay, and that's one way to do that, and that's a perfectly valid way to do it. It's a great way to do it. Okay, it's the way that I would expect probably most of us to do it, just because we're talking about factoring right now. But this is also a problem where you could use a square root if you wanted to. If I add 16 to both sides, this could be another option. I get x squared equals 16. And now I just take the square root of both sides. Don't forget to add in a plus or minus sign. And notice we get the exact same answer. And we actually get it with less work. Okay. So square roots, when they're effective, they're very effective. It's faster, it's easier. Even in this case where I had a shortcut, this was still faster to do. Okay. But here's what I want you to notice. Here's something I want to make sure that you recognize. I can't always use square roots. So what was the difference on this problem compared to the last problem? Why is it okay to use a square root on this one, but on this one I had to use factoring? I didn't have a choice. The reason is because this has x's that are squared and x's that are not squared. And so I can't take the square root of this because the square root won't cancel anything out. In this problem, when I take the square root, I'm only left with x's. And so I can get the x all by itself and life is fine. But in this problem, if I took the square root, I would still have a square root of x. It wouldn't cancel with anything. So it would just be a square root of x. I wouldn't be able to combine these together and get the x by itself. Okay, so in these problems, you'll want to make sure that you're only using the square root method when there's only x squareds and there's no x's. Okay, if you have x's like we did on this problem, then you have to use one of the other methods, either factoring or the method that we'll learn next, which is the quadratic formula. Okay, well, I think that takes care of it for this particular video. We've had a couple more examples of how to solve these, and we've gotten 2 answers for all of them. So thanks for watching this video. Have a good one.